This is the Guarded Inn. It's a classic castle Lego set that was released in 1986 and then re-released as a Legends set in 2001. And this right here is my modern epic remake of the set, coming in at just over 1,900 pieces. Now my goal was to make this a visually pleasing and stimulating MOC that would fit in well with our new medieval display. It looks fantastic on its own, but you should see all the cool little building techniques that I used throughout the set. And oh, by the way, one of the questions is how good does it look next to the other recent medieval sets like the Medieval Town Square, the Lion Knight's Castle, and the Blacksmith Shop? Now to find out more about that, make sure you stick around all the way to the end. If you've ever built a MOC, you know that there is a story behind every project that you have when it comes to Lego, and this one is no exception. Now, before I dive into some of the details of the set, I do want to give you some of the parameters that I set for myself. Number one, you'll know that this is a set that I wanted to modernize based off of this one right here. So this set, you can tell, has a couple of features to it, like the Tudor architecture. It has some of the battlements and things like that that I wanted to maintain for this particular creation. Second, I wanted to modernize this set using modern pieces, colors, using snot building techniques, and of course, angles, which is something that Lego incorporates into all of its icon sets. There's so many really cool moments in piece usage that allows you to get some subtle angles or some very, very strong angles. I want to do that in this. The third parameter that I wanted to set up was that I wanted this to fit into a budget. Now I know that this is pretty large, coming in at just over 1,900 pieces, but I had a lot of these pieces already. What I wanted to do was better utilize the pieces in my collection and try to keep any BrickLink order to about $20 to $25 and no more than that. So of course, as you can imagine, once you set these parameters, there are going to be some moments where you struggle. And in fact, that came in pretty quickly. I experienced what you might be familiar with, and that is what I call builder's block. So it's kind of like writer's block, except you can't really think of what to build. So one of the solutions that I had for this particular creation was to go to Studio and just sit on my laptop kind of later on in the evening or at night after the kids go to bed and just kind of fiddle around with some of the pieces, some building techniques, and get a feel for how I could build this creation right here. Now, I'm not going to say that that works for every single building project that you or I do, but it is one way that I was able to solve my builder's block here. Now, at any point in this video, if you like this and you're intrigued by how to build it, I do have instructions available on Rebrickable. You can find those in the link below in the description. Also, you can check out this other video that I'm tagging up here, where we created a whole story arc surrounding this set, and we had a lot of fun with that with our youngest daughter, Autumn. All right, so now let's dive into some of the details and comparisons between these two Lego items here. Now on this set right here, the original, you'll notice that there are some really cool wall panels. Back in the 1980s, Lego used a lot of these panels, such as these 1x6x5 panels right here that count for castle walls. And they were able to do that to avoid using a ton of bricks, excess plastic, and try to keep the cost down for some of their larger sets. Now, these panels are not in vogue today. You don't see a lot of them used in Lego sets, much less Lego icon sets. And so, that's something that I wanted to think about here. Also, these Tudor panels, which are really expensive on BrickLink, do add some nice angled elements to the set that I wanted to replicate. And so I wanted to make sure as I built this MOC that I included some of that here. You'll also notice that there are windows with shutters. So we've got yellow shutters here. We've got yellow wall or windows right here, as well as this blue door. I wanted to incorporate some of that into the set as well. Now, I didn't want to use yellow as the shutter color, although I could have, but I wanted to use something more modern. I ended up going with some medium nougat tiles that have the wood grain in it. I also used a medium blue door here on the front and the side. So those are some ways I recolored the features from this original set. And then also on the inside, you'll notice that there is this little loft up here that's not really much of a loft, but as a guarded inn, I figured there's probably got to be a room for people to sleep somewhere. So I wanted to do better than that. And of course, these little reversed headlight bricks indicate that there's a second level. So I wanted to include a proper sleeping quarters in my mock. And right, now as we begin reviewing this, one thing should stand out pretty quickly, and that is this completely dwarfs the original. Now that should be the case. This is, 250 pieces or so in the original set. This one's 1900, but this is about twice as high and 1.5 times the width of this set right here. Now, I wanted to replicate these Tudor walls that we find in the original, and so I decided to use a really cool technique featuring brackets. I ended up using dozens of these 1x2 brackets in red that I was able to then take the tiles and put on the side here to make it nice and smooth, but keep that Tudor feel. One of the things I wanted to avoid, and this isn't really a criticism, but I just wanted to stretch my own building technique capabilities, is on the medieval blacksmith, how it has the tiles that are external to the set itself. You put them on using snot bricks, and there's the ridge factor. And that's not a problem to me, but I wanted to make sure that I incorporated this smoothly into the walls. And so I thought that, using a lot of snot techniques would be part of that and would allow me to do that. One of the issues I ran into, of course, with that was repetition. There are a lot of different wall sections using this technique, although I will note that there are different widths of those wall sections. So even though some might be 4, some might be 5, some might be 6 studs wide, it's still a little bit repetitive, but not too bad overall. Now, I will also note that if we turn this around, this corner right here was a challenge. I wanted to do something cool and different, and what I ended up doing was creating this curved wall that has the Tudor element running throughout, and it used a lot of really cool snot techniques. One of the challenges you run into using snot techniques with Lego creations is the geometry of the Lego bricks and tiles and plates. So there's a certain math behind it. Now I don't want to go into all those details here. I think Brick Nerd has a fantastic article on how to use snot techniques and the math behind the width and length of Lego pieces. But suffice to say that I couldn't just use a snot brick and put these pieces on their side. I had to actually use a bracket. That way it would line up with the rest of the wall coming across the whole thing. It's a decision I had to make, but it also presented quite a bit of a challenge moving through this. It took me a little bit of time to figure that out. Now, in attempting to modernize this set right here, I knew that I wanted to use angles. So there are 2 different places I used angles. The first one is over with the bay windows, similar to what we have on the side of the original guarded inn. Now this is not a super complex technique. I basically just use hinge plates very similarly to the Greengrocer modular that came out in 2008. And so I was able to create this little corner on both sides and the bay window by doing that. The hard part was incorporating the snot techniques in with the bay window. That was much more challenging than the bay window itself. And it took a little bit of time to work out some of those things and get the right pieces from my collection to really make it stand out. But I think getting these windows here, fantastic job. And there's a lot of pieces that went into this, a lot of plates, a lot of tiles that I think really turned out well. That's the first angle. Now the second angle comes over with this little mini tower here. Now this is very reminiscent of the Lion Knight's castle. Now that was one of the things I wanted to think about when modernizing the set. There are current examples that I could use. And the Lion Knight's castle, because it came out in 2022, I think is going to set the standard for any sort of Lego medieval set that is not ideas. And so what I mean by that is the way that they set up the windows, the battlements, some of the angles, the way that they incorporate rock work, you can tell is going to be a feature of any sort of Lego castle set moving forward. And in fact, we see this with the medieval town square where it has some of those rocks and the same kinds of windows and these double curved pieces for the battlements. Now, this angle right here is pretty subtle, and I had to use quite a few wedge plates and kind of experiment with things, but in the end, I think it looks pretty good, and it's very similar to what we actually saw in the Lion Knight's castle. One of the key differences, though, being that my windows aren't the 1x4 tiles, rather it's 1x2 and 2x2 tiles here in the corner, as well as along the side of the building. Now there are some other things that I did to modernize the original set. One of them, of course, is the shutters, which you can see here next to the door, which is consistent with this window that's used in this panel piece here. Using the bar pieces with the medium nougat clips and the 1x4 tiles with the wood grain, I think really pop, and it's a much better technique than the old window shutters. Not that that's a problem with those original style, but I really like doing it this way. A second upgrade in terms of building techniques is the door. Here we use this old style door that's in blue. I love those kind of garage door, sliding doors that you can use back in the 1980s, but I wanted to have something more brick built, very similar to what we see with modern Lego sets. So that's another one of those upgrades right there. Another upgrade that we see in this set is that instead of having just a kitchen table here, I wanted to have the kitchen table and an actual kitchen. And once again, I was able to draw some inspiration from the Lion Knight's castle. Now, it's not an identical stove, but it follows some of that similar piece usage and architecture that we see in that set. To go along with that, there's this hallway right here that is consistent with this hall in the original Guarded Inn, but I wanted an opening, and I used a very, very similar technique, actually an identical technique to that used with some of the doorways in the Lion Knight's castle. I really love how they set that up with some of the snot work and some of the scroll bricks to include some detail, and by using that, again, I'm calling out to the Lion Knight's castle and making it very similar to that, which allows it to sit well with that on display, or if people or my kids were to play with it at some point in time. Another upgraded element that LEGO's done a much better job on recently with their icon sets and other things as opposed to their 1980 sets is that there's actually a way to climb up to the different levels. Now, it was a bit hard putting this in and incorporating it into the MOC itself, and I think I made some tactical errors that I might talk about a little bit later on, but I have a ladder here along the side wall that allows you to get up to the second level, the sleeping quarters, and even from there up to the attic area where there's some room where you can store some goods. And so I wanted to make sure we had something that allowed you to get all the way up to the second level. Now, one of the drawbacks with this is that the second level, this battlement up here is only accessible by going through the sleeping quarters, which probably is not ideal. If I were to go back and do this again, I might make this angled wall section right here a bit more prominent, maybe stick out, maybe widen this a little bit, and then allow there to be a staircase or a secondary ladder that allows them to get up to that battlement. So that's something I might adjust if I were to redo this again. Yet another upgrade are the types of pieces that I use. Now, of course, I use plenty of snot bricks and things like that in here that are more recent pieces, but some of them aren't all that new. What I did want to incorporate were these double curved slopes, just like the Lion Knight's castle and the medieval town square, into this for the battlements. I also wanted to use those new 3x3 macaroni tiles that are really cool, that are a recent addition, I think 2022 or 2023 when those pieces were introduced. I also wanted to use triangle tiles because I think those are really cool pieces, and it does help you set the stage for some of your angles, like down here for the bay window. I actually build this on top of some of those triangle tiles so that there's not really much of a gap, but that also the wall itself, the foundation doesn't stick out, and I could put some greenery around the base of that bay window. Another more modern technique that we see are all of these flowers. I love how the modern Lego sets are incorporating some vegetation into the sets. Now, you've got this, which is very similar to the Lion Knight's castle, the medieval town square, but you see other examples like in, for instance, the new Dungeons and Dragons castle. So using this adds a lot of color, a lot of life to the set, and allows you to really experiment with some really cool building techniques. And then finally, one of the other upgrades that I really enjoyed making was the flooring on the first level. Now, I know that looking at this, it's not the most crazy of patterns, but years ago I purchased these 1x1 very light gray plates that were from these old mosaics back in like the early 2000s, and I never really used them in a creation, and so I wanted to incorporate those here. And so it's a kind of a new color I haven't worked with, but adds a little bit of variation to what we see on the floor. Now, which of these techniques is my favorite? Definitely going to tell you at the end, because I think there was a couple sections that I really thought were awesome and a lot of fun and challenged my own ability to build. Even though you might look at this and think it's not all that awesome, I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. So I'll tell you my favorite one at the end. Now, I mentioned when I set up my parameters that it would require some trade-offs, and so I made some compromises throughout the set, and some of them you might agree with, you may not agree with, and so I'm interested in your thoughts. So if you see some of my compromises and you disagree with them or think I should have done something differently, make sure you comment down below. But one of the biggest compromises, of course, is if I turn this around, it is not a full four-sided enclosed building like you see with many Icons buildings. Now, the recent Disney Snow White's castle, or sorry, the Snow White's cottage is not a four-walled structure. It's got that open back to it, and my compromise was not having to order more pieces off of Bricklink to close off these walls. Now, you could do it fairly easily and relatively cheaply, but when I was making my Bricklink order, by trying to limit it to about $20 to $25, including shipping, I had to make some sacrifices, and the back walls were one of those. Another sacrifice I made was with the roof. Now, I think the roof turned out pretty well. I like how it looks, but it does have a lot of studs. And I know that there are a couple different opinions on this, right? You look at some mocks, they try to really clean up the studs and put a lot of tiles and maybe some bow slopes and things like that, the claw pieces on the recent Medieval Town Square. I kept this pretty plain just because I didn't want to order a bunch of black tiles and modified plates, tiles to put on there. Now, you may have noticed a third compromise, and that is this cypress tree right here in the front of the creation. Now, this was a tough one because I love this tree. I don't know where I got it. I had it when I was a kid, and the cypress tree has been one of those pieces that's really expensive on Bricklink and one that LEGO doesn't use. LEGO does use some of the prefab trees in some sets, but they don't use the cypress tree. And so instead what they'll do is they'll use a very parts-intensive snot technique tree like what they use in Rivendell. Now, I could have gone that route, and I was tempted to, but again, cost got in the way. I don't have a lot of those pieces that they use in Rivendell. I have some of the foliage, which we use for our modular city and the streets there. But some of the snot bricks or some of the techniques would require me to add more pieces to that Bricklink order. And so one of my compromises was I'm going to take one of the coolest pieces I have that I'm really proud to own and use it, knowing that it's not something that you would see in a mock today. But I still think it looks pretty good because it is, pretty tall, and I think it has a good shape to it. So that's another compromise that I made. Yet another compromise is with some of the furniture. I wanted to use some modern techniques and pieces, and I was able to incorporate some of that, but I didn't use all of the things I wanted to do. If you buy the instructions, you'll note that I use 1x2 inverted arches in reddish brown, and here I use 1x2 slopes. And again, I would love to use that, but I didn't want to order more pieces off of Bricklink, and those are relatively recent and a little bit more on the pricey side relative to what I wanted to pay for all of my pieces. So instead, I just went with 1x2 reddish brown slopes. So let's talk about how this looks next to other recent medieval sets from LEGO. Now, of course, the original medieval set that we can talk about with this is the Medieval Blacksmith Shop that came out in 2021. Now, that is a fantastic set. I love that set. It's one of the few sets I've given a 10 out of 10 for, and that was kind of the inspiration for how I made this. The scale is very similar to that. One of the key differences, of course, is that the Medieval Blacksmith Shop has that lower level that's more of a basement, and then the stairs leading up to the main level, and then the sleeping quarters. This has the kitchen, the sleeping quarters, and then the attic. But similar in terms of height, and also similar in terms of scale. But overall, I think this looks really nice next to the blacksmith shop. The Tudor really pops nicely, and I could certainly see myself setting up some sort of custom landscape that would allow me to put both of these in there together. To do that, of course, I'd have to close off the back section of these walls. Next, let's see how it looks next to the Lion Knight's castle. Now, you'll notice right away that there's a little bit of a scale issue between the Medieval Guarded Inn that I've made and the Lion Knight's Castle. Now, the castle is an amazing set, another one of those great sets that I'm glad LEGO came out with and I picked up on day one. But one of my criticisms of the set is that it does have a little bit of tightness when it comes to the spacing between rooms and the hallways and even the doorways, which some of which are like 2 studs wide. Now, that means that you're getting a huge castle, but if you put this next to the Lion Knight's castle, you notice that it comes up pretty close to the main gate. And of course, that just doesn't make sense from a castle perspective to have a home and business establishment be as tall as your front gate to the castle. So the scale is a little bit off, and you'll notice that, of course, with some of the Tudor walls, which are shorter than the levels that I have here for the medieval guarded inn. That said, there are some really cool similarities between this and the Lion Knight's Castle. I've talked about some of them before, but architecturally, they look good next to each other. One thing I might think about doing is, if I had an actual display or a layout, is to set this behind the Lion Knight's Castle in some way, shape, or form. That way the Lion Knight's Castle looks a little bit bigger, this one doesn't look as big next to it, and have some sort of like landscape, maybe some trees, a forest, a river, or something that goes between the Lion Knight's Castle and this one and the medieval blacksmith shop. Finally, let's take a look at how this looks next to the medieval town square. What's cool about the medieval town square is that it actually has an inn-based building, which is red with black Tudor, which is similar to what we see with this. I think it's a call out to the original set right here. However, it's the same scale as the Lion Knight's Castle. And so one of the problems you run into, of course, with the comparison between that and our mock here is that the mock is just going to be much bigger. So it has the same problem that the Lion Knight's Castle has with comparisons, and that is it's just going to be a little bit too big to place it right next to it. But still, architecturally and in terms of some of the styles that we see with the battlements and openings, the rocks, the foliage, all of that, there is a similarity that I think make them work in the same universe, even if they're not placed right next to one another in your display. Also, I think this met the goals that I set up. Remember, I wanted to keep it on budget, and I ended up spending about $20 to $22 on Lego pieces and $3 to $4 on shipping and handling, and so I stayed to that $20 to $25 range for my Bricklink order. I think it's also using similar styles to this building, and you certainly see the comparison or the similarities between the two. I also think it's a much more modern version and fits nicely with some of the recent sets. So I think I accomplished what I set out to do in this set, and that's an important thing. Look, I get that, we want to make the most amazing mocks, and there are some fantastic builders, and I wouldn't consider myself one of them. But when I look at this and the work that I put into it, as well as some of the techniques that stretched my own capabilities, I'm pretty happy with the whole process and how it turned out. Now, earlier I said I would tell you my favorite building technique, and honestly, it's going to be this curved wall right here. Spent a little bit of time working on that to make sure that everything worked, and I'm really pleased with how it turned out, especially that it gives you a little bit more room to maneuver at this angled wall section right here. So that's my favorite building technique. And as for critiques, well, I've walked through some of them, but really it was a trade-off between cost of putting tiles and modified plates and other pieces on the roof and closing up the backside. At the end of the day, I thought that spending more would go over budget, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stick to what we committed to at the beginning of the process. All right, so there you have it, my review of my mock here. I'm not going to give it a score out of 10 bricks because I think I'm pretty biased when it comes to how this turns out. But if you like it, you can go ahead and buy the instructions. The link is down in the description below. Make sure you check out one of our other videos. Like this video, subscribe, and always remember to keep building together.